Hi everybody, nice to see you all again. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have a story. This story is hopefully going to be of some interest to, I think it should be of some interest to anybody who studies foreign languages, but I think it'll be of particular interest to people who have an interest in Japan. It's a story about, it's an anecdote from my time in Japan. And we're probably talking about the year 2001 here. So we're talking about a point in time about 22 years ago, quite a long time ago now, nearly half a lifetime ago for me. I lived in Japan, I was working there as a translator, and one night, probably at the weekend, I was out with a friend. We had agreed to go to some sort of house party somewhere. House parties don't seem to be that common in Japan. It's a cultural thing. People tend to go out and entertain. They don't tend to entertain people at home as much. I assume it hasn't changed that much in the interim. But me and my friend had been invited to some sort of house party, some sort of mild, moderate house party, nothing crazy. And on our way there, we decided to stop off at the Japanese equivalent of an off license. That's somewhere where you buy alcohol to drink off the premises. It's basically an alcohol shop. In Britain, we call them off licenses. We decided to stop at an off license to get some drink. When we got in there, I saw immediately that the guy running the place was an old dude, probably about 70, maybe a bit older. Didn't think much of it. But I wandered around, wasn't that familiar with the different types of alcohol on display, not an expert on Japanese alcohol. Of course, they had beer and whiskey and stuff like that too. But I was standing somewhere just looking at, some beer stacked up or something. And this old guy, he kind of sidled up to me in this strange kind of way. And like I said, he was about 70, probably more than 70, but I'll explain that in a moment. He sidled up to me and he started speaking to me in English. Now, when you live in a country and study the language of that country and speak the language of that country, you can get a bit defensive about people speaking to you in English. Sometimes, especially when you're young and your ego is more invested in these things, you can take it almost as an insult when somebody talks to you in English, as a sort of implication that you can't speak Japanese. But be that as it may, this old guy kind of sidled up to me and he started speaking to me in English, probably just asking me what I wanted, what I was interested in. But I realized within a couple of seconds that this guy's English was really good. I thought, that's interesting. So I don't know, maybe I was still at a stage in my life where I would have been annoyed by someone speaking to me in English, but that wouldn't have applied with this guy anyway, because he was obviously really good at English. So I started speaking back to him in English, and I realized within a few seconds that this guy's English is really good. Really good. He was obviously a bit hesitant at first. He stumbled over his words slightly at first, but you could see that was just nerves, because within 10 seconds or so, he was speaking away like a good one, and I thought, whoa, man. No hint of any sort of stereotypical Japanese accent. Basically perfect sentence structure. Great vocabulary. I mean, you were talking to somebody who was perhaps native-ish, someone who was freakishly good, who was way beyond even those Japanese people of a younger generation who speak English quite well. This guy was on a completely different level. And like I said, this guy was in his 70s. So I've since calculated that he was probably born in about 1925. But I'll explain that in a minute. So we started talking and I thought, this is freakish, man. This is the level of ability that you expect from someone when they've lived abroad for decades. You're talking about someone who's really, really good here. And he started telling me his story. Basically, when Japan lost the war in 1945, for those of you who don't know, there was a 7-year occupation, 1945 to 1952. Then the occupation ended. And of course, the United States still has various territories in Japan that it controls. The Yokosuka military base, places and installations in Okinawa, and so on and so forth. But in 1945, when the occupation was just about to start, when the Japanese knew they'd lost the war, they knew that they would have to have a way of interacting, communicating with this new American occupying force. And this guy was one of the people that they picked to learn English. You know, there was a great hostility to English during the war, not entirely surprising. I think that Japanese newspapers were actually banned from using English words. A very different situation then to the situation today. Obviously, they kind of reversed that when the war ended. But there was an anti-English attitude, not entirely surprising. And then the war ended and they thought, okay, we need to communicate with the Americans. This guy, and obviously presumably quite large numbers of other people, but nonetheless, this guy was picked to be an interpreter between the Japanese and the Americans. And that is how and why he learned. Well, that's the why of how he learned English. The how is quite frightening. He said that English language instruction in Japan was so primitive then that they basically gave him an English dictionary, or maybe a Japanese English dictionary, and they said, go and learn all the words in the dictionary. That was how they taught people English in Japan back in the day. Anyway, I don't really understand the ins and outs of how he learned to speak English, but it was obviously something of a baptism by fire. And he learned it really spookily well. And this guy, he told me that he met MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, who was the commander of Allied forces in the Pacific and went on to be the head, can't remember his official title, he was the guy who ran Japan for 7 years, or I think he got fired by Truman actually a few years after the end of the war. But in the beginning, he was the guy who ran Japan. He was the American who ran Japan. You can see photographs of him with the Emperor Hirohito. Anyway, my new Japanese friend, he'd met MacArthur, he'd spoken to him, maybe he'd interpreted for MacArthur, for people, Japanese people talking to MacArthur. And I was just struck by this. This guy probably hadn't spoken English in decades. Today, if you wanted to, you'd have a way of finding a conversation partner online. You could go to italki and just chat to people. This guy didn't need lessons, but he could have chatted to people. But this was back in the early 2000s. These technologies, these opportunities wouldn't have existed. And he wasn't the type of guy who was going to go to a Japanese eikaiwa gakko or anything like that. That's English conversation school, right, in Japan. He wasn't going to go and do that. Hell, when I was in Japan, Nova still existed. I don't know whether you've all heard of Nova, the language school company, the English. But it's basically just English, probably Nova. That went bust a long time ago, probably 20 years ago. Anyway, yeah, this guy, his English was off the scale good, and he probably hadn't spoken it in decades. And he seemed to be so pleased to have an opportunity to speak English. So pleased. You could see how much it meant to him. You could see how much it meant to him to have an opportunity to speak English after all that time. You know, sometimes we learn to speak a language, and then for whatever combination of reasons, we lose our opportunities to speak it. We lose our connection psychologically, socially with the country or the culture where it's spoken. But this guy, I firmly believe that he probably didn't speak it more than once a decade. And I was very touched by that. There's something quite moving about the fact that English was the language of the enemy that had just defeated Japan in a horrific war, dropped 2 nuclear bombs on it, occupied it, yet nonetheless he had to learn it, and you could see how much it meant to him that he had learnt it. What a big part of his life that had come to be, one way or another. I think this guy was 19 or 20 when the war ended. Let's say 20, war ended in 45. He would have been born in 1925. Man, he saw a lot of stuff. Japan changed so much during that time. If he's still alive today, he'll be 98. I doubt he's still with us, but if he is, then I'd just like to raise a glass to him and say, I don't know, otsukare-sama. Yeah, I don't know, I feel a little bit emotional thinking about that, because that must have been a serious roller coaster ride for him as a young man, as a not entirely formed person, as a not entirely formed adult human being. He had a lot of stuff to deal with, but he dealt with it, clearly, and his English is awesome. And I just wanted to share that with you. That's it. Thanks very much for listening. See you in the next video. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.